The Spin-off Podcast Network.
This is Kiwi is back for a brand new season with more inspiring kōrero from special guests including rugby player, father and role model TJ Perenara.
My family bring me joy. Rugby brings me joy too, but it's not the same joy as my family brings me.
And global dancer and choreographer Kirsten Dodgen.
For some reason, people think I'm very intimidating.
Listen to the new season of This is Kiwi, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in collaboration with KiwiBank. Available now wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Microsoft Azure. Turn your ideas into reality with an Azure free account. Get everything you need to develop apps across cloud and hybrid environments, scale workloads, create cloud-connected mobile experiences, and so much more. Discover what you can create with popular services free for 12 months. Learn more at azure.com. That's AZURE.com. And sign up for a free account to start building in the cloud today.
Nau mai, hoki mai ki other folds, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive, tōku ingoa. We're back with the new format, second edition. Had great feedback last week, and so we're just going to roll with it. So welcome, Glenn.
Kia ora, Duncan. Great to be back. Likewise, lots of feedback.
So just to kind of recap, the intention with this new format is to basically provide analysis of recent news in both local and international media and try and sort of tie a bow on how those things fit together. And I thought we'd start this week. It's earnings season in the US with the big technology stocks, which are also, not coincidentally, the biggest advertising players, and so have a huge impact on how the news and entertainment and sports business around the world is funded. So, and that's something that you, Glenn, are super into. So why don't you take it away? Because we saw basically all of them report over the last sort of 10 days or so.
Yeah, the consistent takeaway, I think, about all of them is that they are doing proportionately better on the ad side than traditional legacy media companies. And you often see that during a downturn, right, where they the average buy is smaller for an advertiser. There's very little friction in terms of getting to that buy. Whilst they have had their downturns, they seem to be responding to that pretty well at the moment. And that's also a reflection of the development of their business models, right, as they're reaching more and more consumers in different ways in different places. There's a couple of really interesting results that I think we should talk about. One being Netflix.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. It's interesting, right? Just before we move on to the specifics of it, I've read an emerging critique, and it's essentially that a lot of what drives big technology is performance marketing, and it's very much about the closest click to the sale, and which the kind of ads that sit at the top of a Google search or where you're or even on retail sites beyond Google, and that there's this sort of emerging critique is that you are. That you're ignoring brand when you do that, and that eventually the bill will become due. And even I read quite an interesting story that basically looked at Nike as were once the kind of all-time gods of brand marketing, and that they have kind of becoming more of a direct-to-consumer company. They have kind of eschewed those Whedon and Kennedy ads, which sort of made them such a powerful force in the culture. So there might be something that we can kind of dig into in future about whether that is a real thesis or whether that's actually the kind of the old school media, which is very much sold on brand, kind of desperately wishing that it had more of the big tech kind of market share.
You'd be unsurprised to hear that I have very strong views on this.
Awesome.
But we should do a deep dive on this at some time soon.
Let's do that. But yeah, tell me about what happened with Netflix.
Yeah, so quite an extraordinary result. And, I think we've talked about before that Netflix are in a category of their own now. You can't really call them a streamer or a tech company. They really are emerging as their own category. Extraordinary results. Revenue up 16.8%, in the context of the global market, quite extraordinary.
A mature company too, this isn't a startup at this point.
Yep. Earnings per share up, shareholders very happy. Subscriber growth, 8 million new subscribers in the latest quarter. And a lot of that is coming from two things. That's coming from the password protection that they've put out there to make sure that everyone's paying their fair share, and also growth in the ad tier. But we should just talk about that ad tier for a second because, one could argue there's a lack of baseline data around how big this tier actually is around the world and in specific markets. And even though they've had good growth, it would appear that they are still subscale in most markets they're operating in, particularly when it comes to the big digital video players like YouTube, etc.
I've heard also that they priced it very high, which is kind of getting some people to balking, which is on some level you can see like a Netflix subscriber feels like a really valuable audience compared to a YouTube, which is generally someone who's not paying anything for it. But they've already churned through a couple of executives there, and there's this sense that it's like it was a great story to tell. It was a big change for them. They'd always said no advertising, but it's still yet to become clear that this is actually going to be meaningful in and of itself. But you've got a theory about what it might actually be driving, right?
Yeah. I've got a thesis that actually the reason for the ad tier is actually to drive increased premium pricing for the ad-free model. And the basis of that is relatively simple. By introducing an ad tier, it does a very good job of managing churn, right, at a lower price point. But to make meaningful revenue growth, the scale and volume of advertising you need to have to replace the loss of a premium paid subscriber is quite substantive. However, by introducing an ad tier, what it does do is really test price sensitivity of your top subscribers and test how much are they prepared to pay just to not have ads. And I think creating more elasticity in their pricing strategy is very much around driving price increases for the top tier. And you've been seeing them doing that, by the way.
It's interesting, right? Because churn, just for anyone who doesn't know, is the number of subscribers who cancel in any given sort of period of time. And, all subscription companies, I mean, the spin-off has churn of its memberships. Anyone who's running a month-to-month subscription service has a churn problem, has a churn number that they want to reduce. But notoriously, Netflix and Spotify are two of the lowest churning subscription companies in the world. And that's a massive advantage. And both of them are starting to prove that you can step up prices there. And it is becoming this sort of strong sense that you have Netflix and something else,
Yep.
But everyone has Netflix, and that's just an enormous power advantage over time.
Yeah, and you're seeing Netflix use that advantage to move into other areas of what you might consider traditional broadcast, right? They're starting to do things that are live, live cooking shows. They've just got NFL rights for a Christmas Day game. So I think you're going to see Netflix continue to press that advantage to look and feel more like a traditional broadcaster and deliver so much value back to their subscribers.
Absolutely. So let's move on and look at it's funny. Basically, everyone had good results, but the market didn't necessarily treat them all equally. Yep. Meta also had probably the next best or most impressive result.
So lots of things going on there. Really good cost management from the leadership team there. Doing incredibly well, actually, in the advertising sector. Even Facebook has had growth in subscribers and revenues, which is quite extraordinary in their result. But the big news, I think, coming out of Meta is last week they made public their latest artificial intelligence platform, or the model called Llama, and they made it open source, which is different from the ChatGPT OpenAI model, the Google Gemini model, and the other models that are out there that are closed at the moment. And the market reacted pretty well and pretty positively to that news, and a lot of ambition, I think, for what Meta AI is going to do for the company in the future. I think we should have a talk about open source versus closed source, but I know you've got a view also on Meta and their sort of philosophies.
Yeah, I sort of, they seem like the most kind of all of the big tech companies, that they are the most sort of I guess that they behave most tactically, and some would say, I certainly would say cynically, I think, that there isn't a kind of coherent, joined-up philosophy there. There will be very open where it suits them and where they feel like there's an advantage to that, and then very closed in other respects. They will behave in a very cavalier way with user data in some respects, but also have extreme encryption in others. And it very much seems driven by this kind of, Mark Zuckerberg famously studies classics. He's got this kind of Roman Emperor war mode way of thinking. And I can both find it sort of chilling in terms of the way it impacts society, but also he's responding to an environment that is where regulation still to this point, notwithstanding the kind of still fairly nascent efforts of the EU and California, barely exists. And, that's sort of troubling, and particularly in an AI sense, where if you imagine that combining with the fact that Facebook, as my colleague Anna Rafferty-Connell wrote quite recently, very impressively, I thought, it's kind of a mess of a product, but nonetheless, you just cannot argue with those dollars, right?
Yeah, economic incentives tend to win the day every day.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things about Meta releasing and create and making open source their model is that it goes back to the early days of Facebook and a thing called the network effect, where effectively the focus is on pure growth. The more people that use your product, they create more data. The more data that's created, the better the products and services that can be built. The better the product and services, the more people use the service, and it becomes this flywheel. And making it open source creates that same flywheel because it allows third-party developers and collaborators to come in and help build off the back of that model, create more users, create more data, et cetera, et cetera. So it really does go back to that. The danger and the downside of all of this, of course, is when you have everyone able to access and utilize that model, how do you manage quality control and how do you manage things like bias that come in from third parties into the algorithm and into the system? And how do you avoid the echo chamber type effect? And we've seen, obviously, that become a critical feature of Facebook where, over the years it has created the echo chamber and been the kind of heart and soul of misinformation and disinformation.
It's interesting, right? I mean, one of the most chilling things I saw over the past week was videos of these sort of far-right invasions of UK cities in the aftermath of the stabbing at the Taylor Swift dance class. And that's purely because of the unchecked spread of unverified information. And you just sort of look at it and you go, we're in such a strange place as a society where that is just accepted as part of our kind of social operating environment. And there is no major groundswell to say, is the juice worth the squeeze on this thing? But, it is, I don't know, another statistic I read during the week was that the Russell 2000, which is the next biggest 2,000 companies outside of the S&P 500, i.e. so 2,000 of the 2,500 biggest companies in the US combined have a lower market capitalization than Apple.
Yep.
And it just shows you what a winner-takes-all environment we have, and you see that across every element of what we do, but it kind of, you really feel it in technology and advertising, which our local media ecosystem is unavoidably connected to.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
I mean, that's kind of a nice way to come across into a piece I reported and we published yesterday about the sort of ratings for ThreeNews, for Stuff's version of ThreeNews, which is about a month old as we record this. And, I think when it was announced, there was a sense that there's no way you can do this without foregoing some ratings, but it was an open question. This was a very bold and I think very admirable experiment that we were going to find out to what extent the scale of news and the production values that came out of a particular way of approaching it, how material that was to audience for news. And what we've seen, particularly over the last few weeks, is that ratings in the 25 to 54 demo, which feels like the most, the 5+, which includes a vast number of much older viewers, typically are very stable. But 25 to 54 is where you do see a bit more elasticity. You'll be much more aware of this than me. But to see ThreeNews drop out of the top 20 for 25 to 54 in the most recent Nielsen ratings that I've come across, it was quite a startling thing to witness, and to have them, the numbers under 50,000 for 25 to 54. There's a bunch of different ways you can theorize that, which we'll get into, but I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts on that change.
First of all, I just think it's such an important innovation, for the sector, and, wish everyone success. And I think everyone in the sector, hopes to see success of this innovation. Look, I think it's too early in many respects. I think that the teams will be working incredibly hard. They'll be working very collaboratively together. They'll be looking at all elements of audience. Has there been a change in audience? How are they marketing to the audience? Everything will be under consideration right now. But it's a really noisy time to launch a service like this. They're launched in school holidays. You've obviously had the Olympics, which are incredible, come in, and they pull audience away from everybody every time. It's
interesting, right, on the Olympics, and I sort of noted this in the piece, that TVNZ, despite it's forecasting a loss of nearly $30 million, have still sent a dozen people to the Olympics, staffed by comparison, which actually has to service its website, it has to service audio, and ThreeNews, by contrast, had a team of 4. And I found that interesting timing-wise, that they would remain so kind of bullish, given the hard, avoidable costs incurred by a team of that scale. On some level, great for New Zealand, but that cost has to be met one way or another. And that is a clear point of difference. It's temporary, but if it sort of locks in a viewer, maybe it's worthwhile. But it certainly was quite noteworthy, the different scale of those teams.
Yeah, and look, I think we live in an era of media of probably some conservatism around cost management as a general principle. I think one of the potential drivers of seeing that investment is upcoming rights negotiations potentially for the Olympics, and making sure TVNZ make a good showing and a good fist to show the IAC what they're capable of. Just back to 3 though for a second. So we talked about a noisy launch period. The other thing that I'm really interested in seeing is the impact of the America's Cup upcoming on 3 and on Stuff, because typically what broadcasters will do is use major events like that to promote other shows and other pieces of content. And I've got no doubt that is going to draw a lot of Kiwis in to be watching 3 and to be engaging with Stuff, and they'll be using that really effectively. So for me, I think it's a little too soon. I don't think there'll be any panic buttons being hit at the moment. They'll be working hard together, and I think probably a little later in the year is when we'll start to see the true impact.
I should say I had some feedback from a senior executive within the industry who sort of traced it back to the TVNZ going live at the moment or in the aftermath of the Trump assassination attempt, and using that as a way of drawing a contrast between the live capabilities of TVNZ and this new version of 3, which doesn't have that at the moment. Who knows how it'll evolve. Which is potentially true, and it's without having really granular details, it's hard to, or research, it's hard to kind of make draw firm conclusions about that. But it is, as you say, you've got Jodie over at the Olympics now, so it's a very hard thing for TVNZ right now, and Shane Curry, Media Insider, alluded to this in his column on Friday about this sort of tension between when you're making losses, everyone is expected to kind of look at ways of keeping that as low as possible, but equally when you've got your chief executive going to the Olympics on their own dime, that's a sort of a strange situation. And we'll talk more about sports rights in a future episode, but it is a hard thing, right? The appearance of TVNZ making a bid for the Olympics now would just be, in the aftermath of having cancelled Fair Go and Sunday, you'd think it'd be really poorly received, even if it's objectively the correct thing to do from a future revenue perspective.
Yeah, look, whether they do end up bidding or not, don't know. The IOC, I know, invited a number of members of New Zealand media to attend the Olympics. I think it's interesting that Jodie has chosen to pay her own, but still representing TVNZ in an official capacity. It is a little odd. I suspect recent headlines, maybe a little bit of management going on there. But yeah, I think you're right. One of the big questions is going forward, if they do bid, what do they sacrifice? So if they are predicting ongoing losses, what gets sacrificed? If they are successful, is it other core programming? Is it news content? What is the sacrifice if they do end up paying a large sum for the Olympics?
Moving on, I think it came out 10 days ago now, but a New Zealand Herald project funded by New Zealand On Air called Whenua, which which basically it's a data visualization where you can put in any address in the country, and where records exist, it will sort of point to how Māori were dispossessed of it. Massive piece of work, not completely finished in some respects because the data is necessarily incomplete, but in terms of its ambition, but particularly, I think, to me, in terms of what it says about the organisation's sensibilities, it was a really, really interesting and intriguingly timed, if you think about the sort of general ambient environment politically and socially. And it was accompanied on the Saturday by a very big Simon Wilson feature about the treaty principles and their sort of evolution and our evolution of understanding them over time. And I guess I think about the Herald as it's the closest thing we have to a paper of record. It's got it's part of NZME, which is one of the two big listed media companies that we have, and it has right next to it News Talk ZB, this absolute powerhouse of right-leaning talk. And I think that the proximity of those things, if you look at newspapers like the Herald around the world, in Australia and the UK in particular, there's quite a powerful incentive to sort of subtly move right and to start to reinforce those kind of, conservative or reactionary voices. And, again, this is business. I don't necessarily have an issue with that, but I think it's interesting and quite impressive that the Herald is actually determinedly resisting those forces. And you could see in Simon's sort of feature, he had this quite interesting device where he regularly quoted from emails that the Herald gets sent of people cancelling, saying, here's why, it's because of your use of te reo and so on. And it takes a powerful thing for organisation to read that, to see the impact on revenue and to keep doing it anyway. I just wondered if you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, first of all, I thought it was a phenomenal piece of innovation from the Herald. Just, the technology involved in putting that together was quite phenomenal, and hope they do more of it. Frankly, I thought it was great. Look, from a balance point of view, it's really interesting. If you want to be a mass reach digital publisher, you have to be able to represent all communities. You have to be able to represent diversity, but you have to represent two sides of the debate. And when you're doing that, that's going to come naturally with people that don't agree with a particular side. And that's a given, I think, running these large organisations. The important thing is they do maintain balance. There's no question that, around the world, and you could even, you use the example of ZB, ZB is an absolute juggernaut as a slightly right-leaning, talk-back radio format. It's consistent around the world with those radio formats that tend to be slightly right-leaning in Australia and the US. And you know how much money Fox News is making and continues to make in the US. So there is absolutely a attraction to go down that route. I think, though, the Herald, the gift they have is that they are the publisher of record, if you like, and maintaining that balance is going to be important to be able to maintain that position, that ideological position in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to watch, but they certainly run conservative columnists, so it's not like they're a left-leaning organisation, but I think a project like that epitomises, it sends a strong signal, and where it is not squarely in your, there's an argument to be made against it, but they did it anyway, and I admire them for it. Lastly, I want to talk about, we're going to have this thing where we attend sort of media events. We'll look into that a little bit. I went to the premiere of Bookworm. I want to talk a bit about that and then throw to you to talk a little bit about the local box office particularly. By way of disclosure, I'm good friends with Ant Timpson, the film's director, and also by way of promotion, there's an interview with him coming on The Fold this Thursday, which I really, really enjoyed. But I just want to talk about the premiere as a sort of an event that reminded you of what sort of film can do that doesn't really exist in other sort of media forms. It was at the Hollywood, which is a sort of an established suburban movie theatre, single screen, owned in fact by his brother Matt. But it just, I think there was probably 400 or so people there. A mix of cast, crew, some celebrities, and there's just this kind of crackle that happens when you have a film which has been laboured over, it's been a process of years to bring it there. And, I wrote a little bit about this last week. There's something about, film as being a form that where it's still kind of singly sold versus, streaming, which is subscription based. It just has a different dynamic, has an elasticity of outcome that is, as books do, but as music now doesn't, which incentivizes you to kind of leave it all on the floor in terms of the promotion. And it reminded me of how much I sort of miss that sort of event-based part of media. But also, looking at the sort of slate this year of The Mountain and the film that's opening the New Zealand Film Festival, We Were Dangerous, which had an amazing review on the Herald. That all three feel like this type of adventurous, family-friendly film that's been kind of chased out of the box office, and maybe it's got its shot at coming back. But I wondered if you could, just bring us up to speed with how the local box office has been performing. Yeah,
first of all, just to comment on New Zealand film, we should all be behind and supporting everything we can do to create more film in New Zealand and local television in every facet for a number of reasons. Builds depth and breadth and skills in the sector. It's a weightless export for a brand New Zealand offshore, which is an important part of productivity. And the more we can export skills overseas and people recognise the value of New Zealand, the more then we can import, projects into New Zealand. So big fan of doing whatever we can to strengthening New Zealand film. In terms of the box office, it's really interesting. So it won't be surprising to anyone to hear that during the COVID year, the box office obviously fell through the floor. But it's never recovered back to the pre-COVID days. You had $120, $130 million a year type thing happening in the box office pre-COVID. This year it'll be lucky to break $90 million. And when you look in the mix of that, by far the biggest drivers of box office performance of the large franchise IP-based films. In the last weekend, the latest Deadpool movie, Deadpool and Wolverine, was released. I think it did $3 million US over the weekend. For context, Hunt for the Wilder People has been the most successful New Zealand film in terms of box office performance, and over its entire run did a little over 12 million, and then you have one IP film doing 3 million in 3 days. So, We've got a job to do, I think, as Kiwis, to get out there and support New Zealand film and make sure we do watch at the box office. One of the big things that's affecting that, of course, and you hinted at it, is the advent of streaming, because what COVID did is it taught people that actually I can have a pretty good experience watching film at home, and the choice is really strong. And obviously, the more the international streamers continue to put more films with a very short window. So at the moment, a movie can be in cinemas today, and in 45 days it can be often on a streaming platform. That's quite acceptable, I think, for people. And so behaviours have changed. I also think that there has been the box office or the theatrical experience as a consumer has been quite static for quite a long time. It hasn't changed a lot. And I think you're starting to see a lot of moves in the US where they're really trying to enrich the experience of going to the cinema to make it a bit more unique and a bit more compelling, get people out of their lounges.
That's so interesting, right? I was watching the Warriors on Friday, another super dispiriting loss. But if you when you watch it, it looks like an NFL game in some respects. Like the level of hype, they've sold out every game this season, which has never happened in NRL history. Like it's I think an undercovered phenomenon, which is a weird thing to say about the Warriors given how much media energy they soak up, but just extraordinary to see how the experience of the game has been made so electric that the fact that they've got a pretty dismal record is almost immaterial to the kind of financial success. And you contrast that with rugby, which has for years really struggled to get people into what are actually better located stadiums. And it does feel like that's so true of the theatrical experience, that the competition around whether it's other live events or the at-home experience has gone up a notch, and they just haven't. You go to an event cinemas, it's a pretty bleak experience a lot of the time versus like a Silky Otter or the independent cinemas.
Well, I think, and I think that's a great point. I think the multiplex, the multi-chain, multi-cinema locations, I'd argue there's too much capacity in the system, and reducing that capacity, making it a greater experience has got to be a good thing. And how they do that, don't know.
Well, that's all right. That's why we've got many weeks to come. Thanks so much for this, Glenn. It's been super fun, and we'll be back next week to talk more media.
Sounds good. Thanks, Duncan.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, Podcast Manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.